everyone. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode in honor or in memory of a loved one, please contact the Matan office or email us at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Today's episode has been dedicated in memory of Ezriel ben Yitzchak Leiba by his daughter Sharon Fogel in honor of his 9th yartzheit on the 16th of Tammuz. Eddie Zipperstein, as he was known to most, was a wonderful, sensitive man dedicated to Jewish life and scholarship and was a pillar of the Los Angeles community for decades. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast. Each week we spend 30 minutes speaking about a seminal figure or idea in that week's Parsha. Parshat Matot is comprised of 3 clear topical sections. First, it opens with the laws of oaths, with particular focus on how they operate differently for women. It then continues with the war against Midian, which is the fulfillment of the commandment to wage it several chapters earlier in chapter 25. From this war, we ultimately learn many laws concerning vessel purity and impurity, as well as the Torah's approach to spoils of war. Today's episode will focus on Elazar's role in this war's execution. The third and final section of the Parsha focuses on the request of Reuven and Gad to remain in the Transjordan. They conduct a tense dialogue with Moshe and eventually reach a compromise agreed upon by both sides. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with a returning guest from a prior series before we began speaking about Parshat Shavua, Rabbanit Surale Rosen, who founded and headed Shaila, Matan's women's halachic responsa online, where she currently writes and edits answers to halachic questions in all fields of halacha. She's a graduate of Matan's Advanced Talmud Institute and headed Metifta, Matan's Advanced Talmud program. Rabbanit Surale is also a certified rabbinic arbitrator and holds a certificate in mediation for family conflict resolution from the Israeli Center for Negotiation and Mediation. In the next few weeks, Surale will be starting a new initiative, heading the first Halacha B'Iyun online track at the London School of Jewish Studies. She is also a member of Beit Hillel, where she's active in the organization's program for female religious leadership. Surale, it's great to have you here.
Lovely to be here, Yosefa. Thanks for inviting me to discuss Torah Shebichtav this time.
Great. And I'm sure that all of our conversations ultimately lead towards Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is one of the reasons why I want you on here, because I love that other perspective. So let's jump right into the war against Midian in chapter 31 in this week's Parasha. Where would you like to take us there?
I would like to take us to the confusing point of the onset of the war, where Moshe Rabbeinu is instructed by Kodesh Baruch Hu to wage war against the people who have received him when he was fleeing Mitzrayim, and the discomfort Moshe feels about waging war against the Midianites, even though Hazal say that Yitro was Kohen Midian, but he was basically not accepted by his own people any longer upon meeting Moshe Rabbeinu. Nonetheless, they were the ones to accept Moshe. He married one of the women. And here we start with a confusion that the Ramban points out. If we read the first psukim, Kodesh Baruch Hu instructs Moshe, Nekom nikmat bnei Israel me'et hamidyanim. It's actually very personal instruction. You shall be the one taking revenge for Am Israel from the Midianites, achar te'asef el amecha, and this will be the final thing you're going to do upon this earth before you die. And Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't hesitate. He immediately goes out to the people. וידבר משה אל העם לאמור, החלצו מאיתכם אנשים לצבא. You should immediately take people who are worthy to go to this war, to go to the army. ויהיו על מדיין לתת נקמת השם במדיין. You should be giving the נקמת השם. הקדוש ברוך הוא instructed משה רבינו, נקמת בני ישראל. You should avenge the nekama of Bnei Israel, and Moshe Rabbeinu reverses that, and he instructs Am Israel, Nikmat Hashem. So the Ramban points out there is an element of confusion here. And the Ramban on Pasuk Vav says the following, והנה משה לא ציווה אותם מה יעשו, Moshe Rabbeinu did not instruct the people, the warriors, what they should be doing when they wage war. רק אמר להם לתת נקמת השם במדיין. He only instructed them to avenge a Kodesh Baruch Hu. And what does it mean to avenge a Kodesh Baruch Hu? To be giving revenge of a Kodesh Baruch Hu with the Midianites. And for Moshe Rabbeinu, it was very clear the meaning of what he had instructed them to do. וחשב שלא ישאירו בהם שריד ופליט. He thought that they were going to understand that similarly to how we understand killing off the Amalekim, right? Not leaving every single one of them. This is Nikmat Hashem. This is how, when a Kodesh Baruch Hu wages war, this is how he goes about it. But people are different. People would not do things that are of this nature. They would leave some of the people alive. They would not make sure that everybody is dead. And Moshe Rabbeinu was upset when people did not understand what he meant. And the Ramban points out, Ve'ine katzaf al pkudei hechail. He was very angry when they came back. Ve'chala kavod lepinchas, ki Hashem natan lo et brito shalom. And he was honoring Pinchas while he was being angry with the people, with the warriors. And why am I opening with this? Because when we see later that Elazar Kohen takes the leadership into his own hands and he's instructing the warriors how to get rid of their impurity, how to purify themselves in order to enable them to get back to Machane Israel, we have to understand why Hazal deem it as something wrong that he was doing. He was a misplaced leader at the wrong time. And we have two ways of understanding why Elazar did it and what was the approach towards him taking the leadership and instructing, giving very clear instructions to the warriors of how to get back from the battlefield into Machane Israel. Was he right in doing so? Was he wrong?
Okay, so if I could just recap of what we've said up until now, is that you opened with this sort of psychological insight, which is brought up also in Hazal, of the fact that it might be that Moshe is coming into this war with a conflicted inner state. We won't really ever know. We can't know. But it might be that he's coming in with a conflicted inner state because he has to wage war against people who helped him, from the people from whom his wife is from, her nation. And then you continue with the Ramban, who is basically highlighting a challenge in the Psukim, which is that Moshe doesn't really give many clear instructions for this war. And then the people follow what seems to be intuitive to them. I'll also just add that behind this discussion, which we're not going to get at today, is the general moral question about wars or intention of war to wipe out a whole nation. These are things which still, I'll say, teaching younger students is still of the hardest sections of the Torah, whether it's the example of Midian or Amalek or, most of Sefer Yoshua. In general, the questions of war are complex. And it seems perhaps that according to Moshe, the instructions were clear, but for the people, they were less clear. And this comes up in so many places. I'm thinking about Shaul and Milchemet Amalek, where there he was given specific instructions and he doesn't follow them. But there also seems to be an intuition that we see from Am Yisrael that they don't want to kill off all people. I mean, it seems that whether the instructions are clear or not, they themselves have a hard time with that. So that's sort of like a little moral piece that's behind all of this.
Right. I will add yet another angle to this, that the Psukim mentioned that nobody died in this war. So there was no reason for the warriors to think that they were doing something wrong and that they were not following instructions, because they felt HaKadosh Baruch Hu was with them, right? And when they come back and Moshe Rabbeinu is angry, I think this is where Elazar Kohen is sensing that there is some kind of understanding on Moshe's part as to what the warriors were doing and how they were carrying out this war in a way that seemed to them and seemed klapei shmaya that it was a very successful war.
Yeah, so that sort of adds to this general confusion about what's happening. And so this conflicted space of Moshe, and that leads us to the question of Elazar in the war, yes?
Right, so the warriors come back and they are impure because they are being busy killing people, obviously. and bringing back booty, which also includes vessels, that some of them are tmei met, some of them, all of them are not kosher vessels, and Elazar ventures to explain to the people how to purify themselves from, first of all, tumat met, right, from the impurity of the dead. And the Ibn Ezra and the Chizkuni all write that Elazar Kohen was instructed with the laws of Para Aduma. He understood that it was his turn to turn to the people and instruct them how to make themselves pure in order to enable them to get back to Machane Israel. But he went further than that, and he instructed them how to get the non-kosher vessels, how to do Hagala, how to do Achsharat Keilim, right? How do we make all the vessels that they brought kosher? And this is when Hazal point out that this is something that he was not supposed to do. If he was entrusted with the laws of Para Aduma, he should have kept to Para Aduma, and he shouldn't have gone further to the laws of how to make the vessels kosher. And Hazal understand that this was due to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was angry, and this is not the first time that Elazar sees his uncle, right, getting angry and forgetting halachot. There are 2 more times when it happened in the past, and he understands that it is his role to step in and instruct the people with the halacha.
Let me just put in one piece before you continue, which is for all of those who don't have the pleasure of having a Tanakh in front of them. In verse 13 in chapter 31, Moshe and Elazar appear as a pair. Okay, Vayetzu Moshe v'Elazar Kohen v'chol nesiei Eda. They all go out to greet everyone coming back. It's Moshe, Elazar, and all of the Nesi'im. And then in the next section, in verse 21, it just says, Vayomer Elazar Kohen el Anshei HaTzava. It's just Elazar speaking himself. And
right.
Then in the next section, Hashem speaks to Moshe and there are further instructions given. There is something surprising in all of a sudden this solo appearance of Elazar. And Elazar, as you said, there's only 2 places in the entire Torah where we have the phrase Zot Chukat Torah, and that other place is by Para Aduma, where Elazar is also instructed to be involved. So all the Parshanim and Hazal, they connect these 2 places and say that Elazar clearly, he had his hat was dealing with purity and impurity. But the question becomes, why is it that Elazar all of a sudden is instructing things on his own? I'll just say, Surale, interesting enough that the Shomroni Torah feels so uncomfortable with this verse that it actually adds a pasuk that says that Moshe taught Elazar what to say. Meaning they were just like Hazal, that they're, very up in arms about the fact that before Hazal, that they were up in arms about the fact that Elazar is speaking on his own, but all of this is just to highlight the fact that there's something unusual going on here and that we should draw attention to that. So with that sort of picture of the main players in this war, I think that's a little bit more of an introduction to the way that Hazal look at Elazar and ultimately kind of criticize him.
Right, and I want to say something to the benefit of Moshe Rabbeinu. Perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu, from his past experience and the fact that he was denied entry into Eretz Israel because he got angry, he basically was trying to keep away from the people, keep himself afar from the people so he doesn't get himself even more angry, and he kind of stepped back. But the question is whether Elazar should have respected this distance that Moshe was trying to create and not stepped in instead of him. But Elazar was trying to help bring the people back into Machane Israel, and they really didn't have time to lose. And as I said before, people were looking at it as a very successful war. It was perhaps wrong to keep them waiting, not to enable them to go back to their families, to go back to their normal lives after the success they had. And I want to develop further the question of authority and perhaps the confusion that exists within Aharon's family, Aharon himself and his sons, as to what are the limits of their authority when they're basically standing with Moshe Rabbeinu or standing alone, okay? Mm-hmm. So we have in Masechet Eruvin a long Agadata about the initial Beit Midrash, the first Beit Midrash of Moshe Rabbeinu, and how the Torah was taught to the people. And the Agadah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was basically teaching everything 4 times, meaning every halacha that he was taught from the Gvura, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, so to speak, he had to teach 4 times. So first he teaches Aharon, and then enter the 2 sons of Aharon that remained alive, right? Elazar and Itamar, and they and Aharon together hear it all over again. Then come in the Azkenim, and Moshe Rabbeinu teaches them and the 2 sons of Aaron and Aharon himself the 3rd time. And then the people of Israel walk in, and Moshe Rabbeinu teaches everybody the 4th time. And it is very important for the Gemara to note that even though we could have simplified things and just let Aharon teach his sons, and then the sons could have taught Ziknei Israel, and then Ziknei Israel could have taught the people, why were we troubling Moshe Rabbeinu to be teaching the same halacha 4 times? Because it is very important that everybody should hear from the first source, Moshe Rabbeinu heard mipi hagvura. It is not the same listening to teachings, to instructions of Torah, when you hear it from somebody who heard it from the mouth of God, so to speak. And it was important to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not that he was instructed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be teaching this way, but it was important for him that people should hear it from his own mouth, because he heard it straight from the source. And he didn't worry about troubling himself with so much, doing so much work and teaching so many times. So that leaves space for us to consider, how did Aharon and his sons deem themselves? Obviously, they understand that they are also in charge of teaching Torah to Am Yisrael, because once Moshe Rabbeinu teaches it for the 4th time, then he leaves the tent, and Aharon teaches it, and Aharon leaves, and then the 2 sons teach it, and then they leave, and then the Zkenim teach it, and then they leave, and everybody gets to hear everything 4 times. So it's obvious that they understand. They have a role in the instruction of Torah, not only in serving in the Mishkan, right, doing what the Kohanim are supposed to do, but also they are the teachers of the Torah itself, which makes us understand why Elazar saw it his job to come and instruct the people how to get back into Machaneh Israel.
It's just interesting because I don't remember anymore who, but one of the commentators says very clearly that, if it fits perfectly with this Garata, says if Elazar gave instructions to Am Yisrael, it's obviously because Moshe had already taught him what to say. Meaning he clearly was repeating something that Moshe had taught him, but for whatever reason now he's the main speaker. But it's not because he was making up this Torah, it's because it was something that was taught by Moshe, which to me would also be sort of the simpler way to deal with this question. But I obviously understand that this really opens up a much bigger opening for much deeper questions about authority, about what happens after Moshe. I'm just imagining having to teach the same thing 4 times in a day, and I'm getting dizzy. But
maybe if you've heard it mipi hagvura, right, you will have the strength and the energy. Exactly. We cannot really fathom what it was, this personality of Moshe Rabbeinu, what type of energy it held. But that's for another podcast about can Moshe Rabbeinu be a role model for anything? Because he's just different. I want to home in on what you had said about that it was obvious that Elazar knew the halacha because Moshe Rabbeinu already taught him that. In another instance where Moshe Rabbeinu forgets the halacha, and I'm allowing myself to say that because this is clearly in the Psukim, and Rashi points it out, is upon the tragedy of the loss of the 2 sons of Aharon, right? So we have in Vayikra, Perek Yud, Pasuk Yutet, when Moshe Rabbeinu gets really furious with his brother about not eating the chatat, and he thinking that they had misdealt with the chatat, which was chatat of Korban Rosh Chodesh, which is supposed to be a kapara, an atonement for the people. So Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid that they mistreated the korban and they parcel the korban, and he gets angry with Aharon, and Aharon answers him, and he says, no, you're wrong, I was not supposed to eat it. And then Rashi asks himself, why didn't Elazar answer? Why is it Aharon answering? And it's a kind of funny question, why is Rashi asking that? Why would Elazar answer? And he says the following. First of all, Moshe Rabbeinu turned in anger not to his brother Aharon, but to the two remaining sons, Elazar and Itamar. It was out of respect to his brother Aharon, and I would add even further, not only respect, but understanding the deep grief that his brother was in, right? This is not the time to be angry with him. So he turns to the siblings and he's basically shouting at them. Amru, so Elazar and Itamar, Rashi says, quotes the Midrash, Eino badin sheyehe avinu yoshev ve'anu medabrim lefanav. They chose to keep quiet because it is not badin, this is not the right way for our father to sit in mourning, and we should be speaking on his behalf. Ve'ino badin sheyehe talmid meshiv et rabo. And so too, we should not be answering Moshe Rabbeinu, our great teacher. It is not our role to answer him. Meaning, Moshe Rabbeinu had taught them the halacha. They know the halacha very clearly. But here in this instance, they choose to remain quiet. Yachol mipnei shelo haya be'Elazar le'ashiv. Is it because Elazar did not know the halacha? Is this why he kept quiet? Talmud lomar, and then Rashi brings the pasuk in our case with Milchemet Midian. Vayomer Elazar HaKohen and Anshe HaTzava. No, Elazar is well versed. He knows the halachot very well. He listens when he sits in the Beit Midrash of Moshe Rabbeinu. He knows exactly what to do. But with the instance of losing his two brothers, he chooses to remain quiet. And this is when Moshe Rabbeinu, out of his own sadness and grief, basically forgets the Hilchot Chatat Rosh Chodesh, but he chooses not to say anything. While here, he takes the reins of leadership to his hands and he instructs the people halachically. So we can say 39 years have elapsed, okay? Mm-hmm. Elazar deems himself to be somewhere else than when he was as a young man. That's A. His father is dead. He is now the Kohen Gadol instead of his father. And this might explain why he thinks it's his job to take the reins of leadership, because he knows that Moshe Rabbeinu will not be entering the land. And maybe Elazar understands that he is supposed to show the people that they are not left without clear leadership and clear instructions as to how to lead both their social life and halachic lives. And he understands that it's his job. And I want to read a few midrashic sources about how Hazal approach Elazar instructing the halacha. They don't have a problem with Elazar teaching the halachot. The only problem they have is that they understand Moshe to be standing there, and Elazar teaching them instead of Moshe. It's not that Moshe Rabbeinu went back home to his tent. Moshe Rabbeinu is standing there, but he's not telling them what is the way to purify themselves. You can just picture it, right? All the warriors have come back with all the booty, and some of the people that they have taken as hostages and as shvuim, and they're all standing there waiting. Well, what now? And Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry at them, and there's silence. They don't know what to do, and Elazar understands that it's his job to tell the people how to get in. So we meet two approaches in Hazal to the freedom Elazar took to himself to instruct them halachically. In the Yerushalmi Masechet Gittin, Perek Aleph Halacha Bet, it says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer that Nadav Avihu died because they instructed halacha lifnei Moshe Rabban. We don't have the instance of where they did that, but obviously, according to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, Elazar Kohen knows that it's very dangerous to do what he's doing, and nonetheless he's venturing on doing it. And the question is why he's doing it. And perhaps the Sifri in Bamidbar, which brings us the other approach of Hazal, can shed light into his motivation. And the Sifri says the following, ויש אומרים, משה נתן לו רשות לאלעזר הכהן לדבר. Obviously, you can't assume that Elazar did it without asking permission from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu instructed him to do so. שכשיפטר משה מן העולם, because since we are in a transitional moment when Moshe Rabbeinu is about to die, and he's giving over the leadership to the next generation, and when he dies and he's not there to teach, לא יהיו אומרים לו, people should not turn to Elazar once Moshe is dead, בחיי משה רבך לא היית מדבר, when Moshe Rabbeinu was alive, you didn't dare speak up, עכשיו מה אתה מדבר? Why do you deem it your position to talk now and to instruct us now? So these two different approaches to what Elazar Kohen was doing are remaining in Hazal. They are not decided upon for the very simple reason that these questions are going to move on to the next generations forever to halachic decision making, right? When do we feel we can move? There is a transition point from one way of treating things to another, to introducing new roots of halachic thinking. And I would want to end with a very curious story that takes place in Bavel, in the Beis Din of Rav. Rav sits, he's the dayan, and in comes a moiser, somebody who was planning to give over a Jew to the Babylonian authorities. And Rav Kahana, who sits in the Beis Din, gets up and kills the moiser. And Rav says to him, you have misplaced your authority. You have to go now to Eretz Israel and sit in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan. And what I want you to do is to sit at the very back row, the 7th row, where the weakest Talmidim sit. I wish I was one of the weakest Talmidim in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan. Yes, let's just get things into proportion. And you should sit there and keep your mouth closed for 7 whole years. You're not supposed to answer. You're not supposed to be mechadesh anything. You're just supposed to sit there and listen to Rabbi Yochanan. And obviously Rav Kahana, when he gets there, he doesn't manage to keep himself quiet, and he gets into trouble. And there's a very strange ending to this story. But what we can see is that this dilemma of how much freedom to give to the next generation to take decisions into their own hands, and on the other hand, to teach oneself to sit there and listen to the elders, to sit there and listen to the authority of the previous generation. This is an ongoing question which was never solved, and I don't think that Hazal have any interest in solving it. It is not a problem. It is the very engine that drives the world of halacha, that drives the world of decision-making on. This is what keeps it vibrant, right? We are always at a transitional moment.
Yeah, it presents authority as something that is fraught with tension. I think that's what Hazal are trying to do here. We also have to be aware that there's the text of Tanakh, and we've been bringing a very strong prism of Hazal, but that strong prism of Hazal brings with it the tensions that existed within the world of Hazal. And sometimes those are clearly reflected in the Psukim, and sometimes they're less reflected in the Psukim. I think that everything we've brought right now is very insightful. It's very insightful in that it picks up on tensions that aren't spoken outright in the Torah. Elazar is that figure who shows up at rough moments, whether it's the death of Avihu, meaning he's the person who steps in moments where, as you said earlier, Moshe was sometimes not there fully, perhaps intentionally in this particular case or unintentionally previously in the story of Nadav and Avihu. So Elazar sort of becomes like this paradigm of that person who has to make these decisions about their own authority, and sometimes it's going to work out well, and sometimes it's going to be an overstepping of boundaries. And those, I feel like, are the two positions that Hazal bring. Elazar becomes this prototype of the student. When does the student become the teacher, right? When is that moment when you can assume that authority and it not be overstepping a boundary? And I think that for Hazal, creating the system that they were living and creating, that, as you said, is the crux of the dilemma of when do you innovate? When do you continue? When do you know that you're allowed to innovate? And I think that I can definitely just speak as a teacher, which is obviously a much, much lower level than anything we've been speaking about here today. That moment when you can say to yourself, yeah, I think that was my chidush, right? I think that was my addition. Or that moment where you could say, in my halacha cat, I'll say, where I'll, help with a halachic decision. And sometimes internally, I know that it's like a little bit of a leap of authority, and I know that I have to trust that I've been invested with it, or that I trust myself to know when I have to ask questions. But that dilemma, or that tension, really, it's not a dilemma, that tension exists in anybody who is in a position of authority, when sometimes in order to be an authoritative person, you have to assume responsibility.
When dealing with Shaila, one of the Shailas we were asked was basically a Shaila about Lametet Melachot Shel Shabbat, the 39 Melachot of Shabbat. And one of the Rabbeim in the Hilchata program said to me, I'm not going to deal with this Shaila because it has to do with Gufei Torah, right? The very questions of what's forbidden in Shabbat and what's allowed on Shabbat. And I keep myself away from dealing with such questions, which I found very strange. And I stepped in and I said, yes, but if you ask this question, we're supposed to come up with an answer. I'm going to sit down and write a tshuva about it. And he said, I'm very happy that you don't feel hesitant to deal with the question. You don't deem it necessary to keep away from this type of question. And while I would simply stay away from questions of this type. So this was a very interesting conversation between us as to where he did not want to step in. And I said, but you have to give an answer to somebody who asks you a shaila in Hilchot Shabbat. And one last point is, what kind of an instruction do you give your children? That Pinchas ben Elazar Cohen, he's the one to jump up and to say that you're supposed to kill a person, right? Kanaim pugim bo, you're supposed to kill a person who is boel aramit, who is having sexual relations with a non-Jewish woman. And then we see that Moshe Rabbeinu was happy for him to be doing it. And when we understand the background of Pinchas, the household that he grows up in, which having Elazar Cohen as his father, we understand why he ventured to do so. Right? And there he gets a nishikoyach by Moshe Rabbeinu. So all these tensions, as you had said, are in the psukim, and Hazal find echoes of their own struggles, of their own questions in the Torah shebichtav, then translating it into the Torah shebe'al peh.
Surale, I want to thank you for this conversation today, for sort of bringing in these, the questions regarding the Parshat, but of course how they deeply relate to the lives of anybody today, certainly those with halachic authority, and certainly those who are in charge of continuing halachic authority, which is most of us today as well. So thank you so much for being here.
It's been a pleasure and a real gift for me to discuss with you Parashat Matot. Thank you, Yosefa.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.